Hi, this is the Magnificent Midlife podcast, and I'm Rachel Lancaster. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started, and the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife, about issues that matter, and sharing fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now is our time. My guest today is Dr Kristina Dervaitis, and she is an obstetrician and a gynecologist. But she's also a singer-songwriter, and she's just released a beautiful first album. We're going to be talking about her rather dramatic midlife reinvention. So, Kristina, welcome. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I love the title of the album, Overdue. So, when did you first want to become a professional singer?
This is sort of a dream come true that snuck up on me, in that I actually didn't even realize that this was a dream of mine until it was sort of put in front of me. And I realized that, yes, I would love to try to do something like this. Music's always been a part of my life in the background, in a sense. My husband and I both are very, very passionate music consumers and listeners. And I myself had taken piano lessons from a very young age and was classically trained in piano. But then music was really on hold for me for about 20 years as I pursued my medical career. And it wasn't until about a decade ago that we had a piano in the home again. And I also started taking some guitar lessons. And really, it was just 3 years ago that I started writing songs, and this whole process evolved. So music, from a performing standpoint, from a creation standpoint, and from a singer-songwriter standpoint, really snuck up on me in these last few years, but I'm going for it. So
I think that's amazing that literally you've been writing songs for the last 3 years and you've just put out an album. I think
yeah.
that's a phenomenal achievement. It's incredible. First that you did it, but then the amount of time, not amount of time, a little amount of time in which you've done it. I think it's fantastic. So have you always sung? Because obviously you had the piano and now guitar, and have you always sung?
It's funny, I never considered myself a singer either. And my family's been quite surprised about all of this, because it's not like I was, pursuing singing in any professional or amateur sense all of these years. I was a car singer, tunes blaring, no one else listening, belting it out at the top of my lungs. I even, maybe a little bit of at home karaoke. In our music room, but really, I didn't really consider myself a singer. And when I started this, I had a lot of imposter syndrome, and my initial intention was to, well, maybe I can write songs for other people to sing. But a couple of key mentors who I interacted with earlier on in this process gave me a little bit of validation and encouraged me to pursue this as a performer myself, and said, no, why don't you sing your own songs? So I continued to work on my vocal coaching, and that path to vocal coaching is what led me to a key mentor who triggered a bit of this process for the album.
It's amazing. So you've had some coaching with a mentor. I know I've listened to you to talk about this person who had quite a radical impact on your life, haven't they?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a story of one thing led to another, led to another. I had started to share some of my music on Instagram. I'd only begun performing locally briefly, and then the pandemic hit, and I was wanting to still share my songs and my music. So I went to Instagram and posted some music, and found this new follower. And lo and behold, it was one of my all-time favorite Canadian musicians, M. Griner. And I found out that she was giving vocal lessons. And so through Instagram, we connected, and then I began a process of what I thought was going to be basically just vocal coaching and a way to improve my pipes for some of these local gigs that I was doing. But through working with Em and sharing some of my songs, she sort of nudged me towards the idea of taking this more seriously and pursuing an album, it was actually through a vision board exercise of all things. And I'm always very honest about the fact that at the beginning, I was a little bit skeptical. I hadn't done a vision board. It really wasn't sort of in my wheelhouse in terms of things that I'd tried before. But it was really that exercise that made me realize that I would love to try and do this in a greater scale and to share my music to a larger audience. So meeting M and the work that I've done with M has been absolutely pivotal. And I think if I hadn't met her, I don't know that this album would exist. But once she suggested it to me, my husband and I, he's the drummer on the album, we embraced it, and, attacked the project with surgical focus. And it was basically just a few months after that suggestion that we actually had the album completed.
I think it's really interesting that you say surgical focus, because I know you both come from a surgical background. Do you think that that intensity of discipline and maybe just, I don't know, what's the word? Certainly discipline. I mean, you've got to be very focused to be a medic, and I think then surgery is that next step on, isn't it? I know you were working in a hospital as well until
Yeah.
fairly recently. Do you think that that training enabled you to do this at what I would call lightning speed?
I think so. We're obstetrician gynecologists. We're used to doing 24-hour shifts at the hospital, and you just keep on working and work until the job is done. Not that we were pulling any 24-hour recording sessions, but I think we're used to hard work. We are fairly meticulous and organized in our approach. So, for example, for the album, once we decided, very quickly, I had 10 songs ready to go that I wanted to put on the album. And we just started to attack it in quite a regimented fashion in terms of one song a week, preparing demos in our home music studio that we had just set up. And yeah, and in terms of rehearsing for the album release concert, it was very reminiscent of my early days of studying and preparation. I kept joking with people that I haven't prepared for something like this intensely since my Royal College board exams for obstetrics and gynecology. We really just, practiced for months and months. And because it was the first time we were doing a really like large concert when we did the album release concert in support of the hospital that we both formerly worked at. So definitely I kicked into that same sort of mode, tapped into some of those same resources that I know got me through my medical studying career. So
And you went back to the hospital to do the album release concert. How cool is
yeah.
that?
Yeah, it wasn't actually it wasn't actually in the hospital, but it was in a
For the
theater nearby
hospital.
in the town where we both worked, Newmarket, Ontario. And so it was in support of South Lake Foundation, which was the hospital that Barry and I both worked for more than a decade. So it was a really special night
Mm.
to be reunited with so many former colleagues and friends, and to give back to a cause that was obviously near and dear to both of our hearts. So
And for them to also share in your metamorphosis, I should imagine as
yeah,
well.
yeah, no, it was fun. And really, there was so much support. I will confess that I was a bit, and by a bit, I mean a lot, petrified
I
of
bet.
what were people going to think? Like, has Christina lost her mind? Where is this coming from? Especially since there was no even hint of this aspect of my life in the years leading up to this and prior to my departure from the hospital. So I was very nervous about how this would be received by not only former colleagues, but patients and friends and family. But the response was overwhelmingly positive, and it was just so, really meant a lot to both Barry and I to receive such support for this project.
Fantastic. I think it's amazing. Really, really hats off to you. I think it's fantastic. So I know that you've made some shifts, haven't you, to enable this to happen. So you moved out of working in hospital, but you're still working as an obstetrician gynecologist, aren't you? But in a slightly different way, is that right?
Right. So a bit of background on that shift. So that was sort of metamorphosis number one, I guess, in my midlife. So at the age of 43 in 2019, my husband Barry, who's a, a little bit, I'm going to say that by a little bit, I mean a lot, who's 1 or 2 decades older than me. He was preparing for his own retirement. He also is an obstetrician, gynecologist, and pelvic floor surgeon. So Barry was preparing for his retirement, and I knew that the rigors of a generalist or a typical obstetrician gynecologist practice would not be conducive to the sort of retirement that we envisioned for Barry. And so I had to sort of take a hard look at my work life balance and decide what we were going to do in these next years. And so, weighing in a number of different other factors as well, I made the decision to step away from hospital medicine, and to basically retire, in a sense, from obstetrics and surgery, and to shift to an office only private gynecology practice, with an emphasis on contraception and the intrauterine device. So it was a huge, huge decision to make and a big leap for me. But in hindsight, it was the right decision. It was motivated by that. It was not that, oh, I'm gonna try and be a rock star and I need to cut back from my hospital practice to do music. Really, the opposite happened. It was the shift in my duties as a physician, and the extra time that I now had on weekends and nights and whatnot, as a private practitioner, that allowed the room for me to start exploring music. And so I know for sure that if that shift hadn't happened, this music side of my life wouldn't have had a chance to flourish because I just wouldn't have had the time. So that one big shift led to this.
But I'm guessing perhaps also that the fact that you'd made that change drove you on even more to make the singing a success. Do you think that was the case?
It's really, I mean, without having had the room to explore this, again, this wouldn't have happened. But it became sort of a feeling that, you know what, I've already done one incredibly scary thing. This maybe seemed a little bit less scary, having successfully navigated such a huge change. And really, I think it opened my mind to new possibilities. For example, when I started my contraception practice, or my gynecology practice, with the large part of my patients being seeking contraception and access to the intrauterine device, I started a YouTube channel that was initially intended just for my own patient population, but it grew enormously, and suddenly I had viewers from all over the world, several thousand followers, and subscribers on YouTube, now close to 1 million total video views. So that was something that happened that I had never ever anticipated previously. And I think experiences like that opened my mind to the idea of change and new possibilities, and to keep an open mind to new opportunities, and to allow myself that freedom to explore new things. Yeah, definitely, I don't think that my mindset was in that same place when I was just doing my typical OBGYN practice previously.
And I find it incredible that you said you only started actually writing the songs 3 years ago, and then you're here with an album. So where did these songs come from? How did you open yourself up to possibility to allow these songs to come to you? What was the trigger? What happened?
So I started writing songs actually in the middle of the night, and one of the first songs I wrote, it was 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and I struggle with insomnia. It's been getting better recently, but I've had chronic issues with sleep. And so one night, I don't know how it occurred to me, but I started writing a song lyric in my mind as a way to try and distract myself from other racing thoughts. It turned out not to be a very a very good tool for dealing with insomnia, because then I was up trying to finish the lyric and then worrying, am I going to remember this in the morning? Should I get up and write this down? But it really was as simple as that. And the lyrics are really the origins of all of my songs. All of my songs start as lyrics first. That's really the most important part of songwriting for me. And they just sort of started coming out of me, and I really used it as a stress relief tool, as a journaling tool, that if I was feeling something, I would, or if I was feeling stressed, I would go and play a song that I'd previously written. Or if there was something going on, I would somehow spin it into a metaphor of some sort. I use a lot of metaphors in my songs, and would use it as almost a journaling tool. So, and they just sort of kept coming, and I think, I almost felt compelled to keep writing and continue to feel compelled to keep writing. I've already written most of the songs for the next album, and it
Well, of course
really
you have. I mean, come on. You're just a compulsive overachiever.
a month after the album release, I'm working on the next album. But no, it really has felt like a bit of a calling. Like, I sort of have embraced this idea that I think I'm meant to do this, like that it's not a coincidence that all of these things have happened and lined up to allow me to
The
do this.
dominoes
So
have started to fall, haven't they?
yeah, and I think that, and I have a bit of, I mean, I've listened to music all my life, but I don't have any formal training in songwriting or structure. I was doing this all based on, like, by ear. I've forgotten most of my music theory from back when I was 13, 14 years old doing my formal studying. So I do all of this by ear, and by instinct. And I sort of feel like it's not a coincidence that I've been able to tap into this. I need to keep going with this and see where it leads.
And I know also that you've used the songwriting to help you process pain, haven't you? Can you tell us about that?
Around the same time that my songwriting was really sort of coming to fruition, unfortunately, and this was just before the pandemic, unfortunately, my mother, who was a previously healthy, no medical conditions, a healthy 70-year-old, she was suddenly diagnosed with end stage pancreatic cancer. And it was just 6 weeks later that we were all at her bedside when she passed away. So that was, the single most traumatic experience that I've ever gone through. And it was a lot to process, still is, and really did inform some of my songwriting at the time. One of the songs on the album, called Dust, I wrote just a couple of weeks before my mother's death. And so, yeah, and I continue to use songwriting as a place to put my emotions quite intentionally. If something very intense or feeling, like, overwhelming has happened, I, like, quite intentionally now head down to the piano and see what comes out, and try and process my feelings that way.
I'm really sorry for your loss. It's
Thank you.
that must have been so just very traumatic. But I know
Yeah.
it's spurred you on to not waste any more time as well, hasn't it? It's given you the thought that
Most definitely. Like, I mean, between that experience and then a month after that, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. It really, the concept of, life's too short, and all these things that sound like, I hate to use the term cliche because it has sort of a derogatory negative association, but just like, important statements about life became much more tangible to me. Like, life is too short. What do you have to lose? You never know when your last day on earth is going to be. These sorts of concepts definitely spurred me on, for sure, and helped me realize that, if I've got an opportunity, there's no reason not to go for it.
yeah, mortality can we can get a real sense of our own mortality when we are confronted with death and certainly a global pandemic, can't we? I think that for a lot of people,
Absolutely.
it's really made them reassess life. It certainly made me
Yeah,
reassess life. But I was doing that already, I think, but it's
for
kind of
sure.
been put onto steroids.
Yeah, and then you think, like, I mean, this was, I don't want to misrepresent myself that I'm just sort of this ball of courage moving forward in the universe. Like really, I was at each stage, there was so much fear and imposter syndrome and who do I think I am and what are people going to think and, you know, fear of embarrassment and whatnot. But then you really do, you unpack all of that and say, well, what really is the worst that's going to happen, right? Like, you know, like what do I really have to lose? I mean, I've been really fortunate, of course, in this endeavor that I'm doing this as a passion project. I'm not trying to make a living at this. And my hat goes off to all of the professional musicians out there who are earning their living and paying rent and the bills with that project. So I had that luxury, and again, compared to my previous job where or my hospital based job that was quite a bit more intense in terms of big big decision making and big potential consequences. I had to say, you know what, if this doesn't work, or if I perform and I hit the wrong chord or have to start a song over, which fortunately didn't happen at the album release concert because we prepared. But what's the worst that's going to happen? No one's dying here, no one's hemorrhaging, like, no, you know what I mean? Like, it just sort of helps to put things into perspective. So
Yeah, you had that sense of perspective, didn't you? Because
for
you
sure.
held people's lives in your hands, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Yeah. Although, that's not to discount the important role of music. And that's something that, I've even had to come to terms with that as I transitioned to my office practice. So here I was doing a hospital based, I had a hospital based practice where I'm doing on call, I'm doing surgery. Obstetrics has a lot of life or death moments. And, to realize that the work that I was doing in my office for contraception and prevention of unplanned pregnancy, it might not be sort of life or death in the moment, but it definitely can have an enormous impact on a patient's life and is still very impactful and important work. And so I came to terms with that. Similarly, I've been reflecting on just the enormous place that music has in our lives and the therapeutic role, not just therapeutic in terms of the songwriting, but there's so many albums and pieces of music that have helped me through difficult times in life. And I really do think that music has a healing power and a therapeutic power. So I feel very fortunate to have had this sort of therapeutic role as a physician in the more traditional sense. But I really hope that my music has a chance to connect with listeners and to really reach listeners and might maybe even have some sort of a healing power there. My goal with the music is really to connect in a deeper sense. So yeah, a lot of reflection lately on the role that music plays in our lives.
So tell me a bit about the lyrics as well, because I know the lyrics are very important to you, and you've been including sort of issues for yourself personally, but midlife themes as well within your lyrics. So tell me a bit about the lyrics and the importance of those and what some of the themes are.
Yeah, so not every single song of mine is autobiographical, but most of them are, having to do with a theme that, has recently or in some context has been important in my life. A lot of the songs talk about transition and discovering yourself and looking inwards and making difficult changes. Also, the idea of a story that's still being written. Actually, the first single that I released and the first song on the album, called Still Don't Know the Words, I actually wrote it in response to my first meeting with M. Griner as we were about to start our vocal coaching. And it was just supposed to be a get to know you sort of a session and tell me a bit about yourself. And I was feeling overwhelmed. I'm like, how do I package myself all up neatly and tie a bow on top of it? What do I include? What do I say about myself? How do you summarize your life? How do you summarize a life that's still in evolution and tell the story of your life when it's still being written? So that's what Still Don't Know the Words became about, was about just this idea of how we carefully craft how we're presented to the world. We see this a lot with social media as well. So those were some of the themes that I explored in that song. Another single release from the album called "What's Coming," for example, I actually wrote just a couple of weeks before we went into studio, and I was feeling overwhelmed at like everything was happening and it was just so exciting and a dream come true. And there was like a voice in my mind going, "Oh, don't get too excited. This is probably nothing's going to happen. And if it's too good to be true, it probably is." And all of these sort of defense mechanisms that we have, that sometimes prevent us from fully embracing joy. And so, what's coming is about that sense of apprehension when things are going well, and the difficulty that we sometimes have in fully embracing happiness because we're afraid of future uncertainty. So, these are just a couple of examples of things that were going on in my life and ways in which I turn them into songs.
Sounds like you're writing an album of anthems for midlife women. Because so many women, they put a full stop, a period, around the time of 50, and they don't see beyond it. And yet, you're not reaching 50 yet, but you are already creating this whole new life for yourself, and you are completely open to possibility. And that's very much what I'm always trying to get women to be, is open to possibility. And as you said at the beginning, earlier on your vision board, is to dream, is to really dream about what may be possible, because we often shut ourselves down, don't we?
Yeah, yeah. And again, I fully credit M. Griner and the coaching work that she's done with me. I think I would definitely never have done the album or gotten this far without her coaching. A lot of the work that we did wasn't simply vocals, but was around mindset, and I found that really helpful in terms of muting some of those negative voices that would creep in from time to time. The "what do you think you're doing" or "who do you think you are" voices that we sometimes hear when we're embarking on something that's a bit scary and new. But yeah, it's funny. I guess I'm quite precisely in midlife. The album, not coincidentally, I decided to do the album release on my 46th birthday. I joked that this was all just an elaborate ruse to throw myself a big party and get everyone together. But yeah, I think, you know what, perhaps I've had a different perspective on age as well because of the age difference between my husband and I, that I've been a little bit trained in the sense of not to really be too fixated on a timeline or on, your actual age. I'm not sure if that has played into some of my mindset that allowed for this to happen, but
Probably, yes. I would imagine it probably did, yeah, because there's your husband, he's in retirement and he's now a drummer on a new album.
yes,
So, yeah,
yeah,
it's great.
yeah,
Fantastic. Yeah. But what I really like about what you've done and you've talked about is that you've been willing to do the work, because sometimes we want change, but we're not willing to do the work. And I think you learned how to play the guitar quite recently, didn't you? Having not
yes,
played the guitar before, and you
yeah,
then went and got training for your voice. And you've inspired me actually, because I'm a singer, but I'm a choir singer, and I will never sing solo, and I don't think my voice is good enough. But I know that if I practice enough, it could be.
yeah,
But I
yeah.
don't do the work. I don't practice. And I don't know why that is, but I don't. So I think it's really good that you've decided what you want, and then you've worked out what you need to do to get what you want, and then you've gone and done it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, just what you're talking about, that, oh, I could never do a solo, I I'm going to challenge you to say that is false. And what I've learned with my teaching from Em is that really anyone can learn to sing, and it's like a muscle. And the difference in my voice from working on this process from like basically just a year ago is like enormous. And I'd highly recommend her book. She just actually released a book. So it's called The Healing Power of Singing. And again, her name's M. Griner. And it goes through, I mean, basically, she wrote a book that quite nicely summarizes most of the steps that I went through with her. And it speaks to both vocal training in the sort of physical sense, but also mindset. And it was a joy to read. It's just so humorous and great. But to any aspiring singers out there, know that anyone can train and work on their voice if they have the motivation. So
I'm going to really share something now. My husband will be listening to this at some stage. And so choir had to stop during COVID because, of course, nobody could sing during COVID. And it's only just started back up again, but in a much kind of reduced way. And we're not going to be doing the new term. But my husband has been learning the guitar. And throughout COVID, he was like, well, you can't go to choir, so sing with me. And he's been wanting me to sing with him, playing the guitar, and he's learnt a song that, we could do together, and I haven't done it. I don't know whether that's fear or what it is, but I'm gonna have to
I challenge
take
you.
the inspiration from you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is how it begins, in a future podcast, we'll be hearing about your album together. No. Just kidding.
Why not?
Exactly.
So I'm sure that a lot of the people listening to this are going to be thinking, well, that's all very well for Kristina, but I've got all the responsibilities with my children and maybe older parents as well. And sadly, you don't have your parents around anymore. But I'm interested that you don't have children. And I did ask before we hit record whether I could ask you about this, but you actually made a conscious decision not to have children, didn't you? So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that and how the music and what you're doing now and following your dream now, how that fits and whether that has been a sort of natural growth out of not having had children, that you have the time and you have the energy and you have the creativity to do that. I don't know. I didn't perhaps ask that question very well, but what do you think?
Well, I used an obstetrical reference or term for my album, not coincidentally. And, I've often joked that this album is sort of like my baby being brought into the world kind of thing. But yeah, no. So a lot of people have been curious about my decision not to have children, particularly given my career choice and the fact that, my entire practice, in fact, prior to my recent shift, probably about 70% of my practice was obstetrics and helping patients through pregnancy and delivery. And, it wasn't something that, growing up, I anticipated that I would decide not to have children, but it just sort of, again, my life, the flow of my life led me to that conclusion. And I, made some decisions. Obviously, when Barry and I first met and started dating, he was at a different stage in his life. I do have 3 amazing stepchildren who are older and have their own children. So I always joke that I cheated. I got to have the joy of grandchildren without actually having to carry a pregnancy. So certainly there was that aspect of here I was, being enveloped into an already existing family, and life felt very full in that sense. I also was at a crossroads where my career was taking off and it was incredibly demanding. And I was, a bit concerned about how I would handle the idea of parenting while doing such an intense job. And I know that my hat's off to all of my colleagues who have mastered this. But just based on my own personality type, I knew that I would feel torn if placed in that situation. So there was a number of variables that sort of led to this decision that, life is very, very full and rewarding. And so I continued on, and children just weren't necessarily a part of my future vision. And but I had a very full life and was happy to still have this joy of that moment of handing a child over to their parents, and seeing that joy play out in other people's lives. The fact that I was able to do that shift after shift after shift at the hospital without any sort of nagging feeling or voice in the back of my head, or like sort of a longing there, I think was, my decision was tested on a regular basis, and I continued to feel really secure in my decision, and really happy with the life that I had formed. So
I think that's amazing, because that's not something that none of the guests that I've interviewed, we've talked about that at all, that it was a conscious decision not to have the children. So thank you very much for opening up about that. And yes, I can imagine you were, that decision was tested on a daily basis for you, wasn't it?
yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, and it's still your world, isn't it? Even
yeah.
though, obviously you're progressing the singing now, you're still very much, working with women on contraception now.
Absolutely, absolutely. So
Do you plan to carry on being an OBGYN, or if this all takes off, will you ditch that and just be a singer?
I'm not quitting my day job just yet. No. It's hard to say. Like, I think I'm learning not to not to try and plan my life too far out in advance, because like best laid plans, my whole life I was someone who's like, like 10-year plan, 20-year plan. And if you had asked me even like 3 years ago, if I would be doing this, I would have I would have been astounded, and it just wouldn't have ever occurred to me. So I'm really recognizing that life evolves, and it's great to have plans, but plans change. And I mean, I'd be open to pursuing this in an even greater sense in terms of performing and touring and all of that sort of thing. But right now, my practice, because it's fairly elective in terms of contraception, it does allow me tremendous flexibility in terms of being able to shift office times and to take time off and return to my practice, versus pregnancy, which has no pause button. And again, that was part of my decision making, when initially our plans were to do some more traveling, and then of course the pandemic hit. But we'll get back to that soon, I hope. But yeah, so right now there's so much flexibility in my current practice structure that I foresee myself being able to do both. But in all ways, I'm keeping just my mind open to future possibilities, and we'll see what happens.
I love that you were able to do that, though, because often I think when people do have a dream and the day job, the current existence is just, it's so all consuming that it's impossible to envisage another possibility. But you were able to shift, weren't you? You were able to kind of move sideways, shift gears, enable the day job to continue, but in a different way, which then allowed you to free up the time to be able to pursue the dream. So it's actually,
Yeah.
you're a wonderful case study in how women might do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to know that, like, I think most people, when they're making a change, when you close a door, it's not as though you're putting 10 padlocks on it, and, that there's not any flexibility. My case was perhaps a little bit more dramatic in that I knew that the longer time I spent away from hospital medicine, that it would be difficult to reintegrate. There are channels to re-enter into practice, but because of the technical skills required of surgery and obstetrics, obviously it's not something that you can go away from for many, many years and just plunk yourself back in, kind of thing. So for me, there was a little bit of extra pressure there in my decision making to make sure that this was really what I wanted to do. But I'd say in most instances, when people are making a change, remember that it doesn't have to be as final, and as hearing a door slam behind you. It's okay to creak open some doors ahead of you, without having that fear that you can't ever take a step back if you decide to.
Well, I think what you've achieved is tremendous, and I would encourage everybody to go and listen to the album. It's available on Spotify, and I've been listening to it. It's lovely, really lovely. So
Thank you.
finally, what advice do you have for women who have unfulfilled dreams?
I would say, if there's a nagging voice, if there's a voice at the back of your head, don't ignore it. And I really would say that for me, coaching was critical. So I think that if you have that ability to tap into that sort of a resource, that finding a coach that can help guide you through the transition may be helpful. I think it's really important, obviously, to find the right person and mentor, but really that was, I think, a critical part of my ability to make this transition. And I'd say also just looking for other stories of other people who have successfully navigated change does help. I really tapped into a lot of blogs and just physicians who had made tremendous practice changes prior to my own decision to leave the hospital. So I really relied on a community of others out there who had been going through similar changes, and that was really helpful for me in my decision making. So sometimes having these, access to these case studies and evidence of other people who have also successfully navigated change or taken a big leap in their lives, I think can be helpful.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow, and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife: Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.